I was the kind of employee companies don't know they need until they've already lost her. Not the one who gives speeches at all-hands meetings. Not the one whose name gets called at the annual awards dinner. I was the one who knew the contract renewal date for every major client, who kept a mental map of which executive had promised what to whom, and who stayed until 9 on a Friday because someone had to make sure the Q3 numbers were actually right before they went to the board. I didn't need the credit. I needed the work to be correct. That was just how I was built. My name is Brooke. I had spent 11 years at Calloway Precision, a mid-size manufacturing consultancy out of Charlotte, working my way from junior analyst to senior operations director. 11 years of learning every broken corner of that company, patching what I could, documenting what I couldn't, and quietly making sure the machine kept running while the people at the top took bows. I loved it. Even when it was hard, I loved it. That's the thing nobody tells you about being good at your job in a place like that. You get attached. The work becomes part of who you are. The clients start to feel like people you actually know, because they are. You've been on the phone with their CFOs at midnight. You've talked their procurement teams off leches. You fixed problems they didn't even know they had. Then my company brought in my new VP. He came from a consulting firm in Atlanta that had folded under circumstances nobody wanted to discuss too loudly. Word was, he'd burned through 3 client accounts in 18 months. But he had a way of presenting himself that made rooms go quiet in the good way. Confident, polished. The kind of guy who uses the word synergy without flinching and somehow makes you think he invented it. He was 44, divorced, and had the energy of someone who believed every room he walked into was already his. From the moment he arrived, I watched how he operated. He pulled junior people aside for mentorship conversations that were really just data collection, finding out who knew what, who was close to which client, who had the informal power no org chart would ever show. Then he'd use that information to position himself, not maliciously at first. Or at least not obviously. It looked like leadership. I introduced myself the day after he started. Walked into his office, offered my hand, gave him the quick version of my portfolio. He leaned back in his chair and smiled the way people smile when they're already 3 moves ahead of you in a game you didn't know you were playing. "Brooke," he said, "I've heard a lot about you. You're the one who holds this whole thing together." I thanked him. I should have paid more attention to the fact that he said it like it was a problem. The first few months were fine. I kept doing my job. He kept having his vision-setting conversations and sending emails with phrases like accelerating our trajectory and leaning into transformation. I stayed out of his way and he stayed out of mine. Then he started making small changes. He moved the Devereaux account, my biggest client, a relationship I'd personally built over 6 years, to one of his new hires. He framed it as load balancing. I flagged my concerns in writing and was told it was a done deal. Then he pulled 2 of my direct reports into a restructured workflow that left me managing processes I'd designed, but no longer controlling the people executing them. Every time I pushed back, the explanation was reasonable on its surface and wrong underneath. I went to my manager about it. She listened. She was sympathetic. She told me to give it time. Time was not fixing it. By month 6, I was being left off meetings I had always been part of. Emails that used to CC me now didn't. At first I thought it was an oversight. Then it happened 3 times in a week, and I stopped thinking it was an oversight. The worst moment, the one I think about when I'm trying to explain what this kind of thing actually does to you, happened on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I walked past the small conference room on the 3rd floor and saw one of my colleagues through the glass door. She was sitting alone at the table after a meeting. She wasn't crying exactly, but she was close. Just staring at the table, not moving. I'd seen that look before on people who'd been told their work wasn't measuring up in ways that didn't hold up when you looked at the numbers. I knocked, asked if she was okay. She gave me the smile people give when they're not okay and know you know it. She'd just had a one-on-one with him. He'd told her she was too emotionally reactive for client-facing work. She had managed client relationships for 9 years without a single documented complaint. I walked back to my desk and sat very still for a long time. I want to be honest here. I thought about quitting. More than once. I updated my resume in October. I had a call with a recruiter in November, but every time I got close to actually leaving, something pulled me back. The clients I'd fight for, the people on my team who'd followed my lead for years, the conviction that what was happening was wrong and somebody should be paying attention to it. So I started paying attention to it. Not in a dramatic way. I didn't set up some grand scheme. I just started keeping records. Every meeting I was excluded from, I noted the date and who attended. Every time a decision was made that contradicted our documented protocols, I kept a copy of the original protocol alongside the new directive. Every time a colleague mentioned a strange interaction, I wrote down what they said, when, and their exact words. I wasn't building a case. I was just refusing to let the truth disappear. I also started talking to clients. Not about what was happening internally. I'm not that kind of person. But I checked in more than I needed to. I asked questions. I listened. The Devereaux account, the one he'd reassigned away from me, called me directly in December. Their procurement lead, a man I'd worked with for 5 years, said he wasn't comfortable with how things were going. Said it felt like the institutional knowledge was just gone. I told him I understood and that I was still at the company if he needed anything. He told me he was going to put something in writing to his executive team. I didn't ask him to, I just filed that information away. By January, I had a document that ran 43 pages, not because I was angry, because I was thorough. Every quarter, Calloway hosted what they called the Excellence Summit, a client appreciation and internal recognition event held at the Ballantino Hotel in South Charlotte. It was the company's biggest night of the year. A few hundred people, clients flown in, executives giving remarks, the whole production. It had always been something I helped organize. That year, I'd been quietly removed from the planning committee. I found out through the venue coordinator, who called me by accident because my name was still in her contacts. I went anyway. I was still a senior director. Nobody told me not to. I wore a dark green dress and I got there at 6:30 and I stood by the bar and I watched the room. He had been busy. I could see it in how the event had been set up. His hires in visible positions, certain veterans sidelined or absent entirely. He had spent 9 months reshaping the room to reflect the company he wanted, not the one that existed. And watching it from the edge, I realized he thought he'd already won. He found me around 7:15. I was talking to one of the regional VPs from our Midwest division, someone I'd known for years. He walked up, smiled the smile, and without any preamble said, "Brooke, I've been meaning to talk to you. We're going to be making some changes to the senior leadership structure. I think it's best if we start that transition tonight." The regional VP went quiet. I looked at him. "Tonight? It doesn't need to be a big thing," he said. "HR will reach out Monday, but I wanted you to hear it from me first." He said it the way people say things when they want witnesses to see them being gracious. I took a breath. One breath. Then I said, "I appreciate you telling me. Excuse me for just a moment." I walked to the ladies' room. I stood at the sink and I looked at myself in the mirror for about 30 seconds. My hands were steady. I noticed that. I had been afraid they wouldn't be. Then I walked back out. Our company's parent organization, a larger holding group based in Chicago, had 3 representatives at the event. I had worked with their director of portfolio operations before, a man named Whitfield, during a particularly complicated audit 2 years prior. We had a good working relationship. I found him near the back of the room with 2 of his colleagues. "James," I said, "do you have a few minutes? There's something you should probably know before the end of the evening." He looked at me. He could tell from my voice that this wasn't small talk. "Of course," he said. We stepped into a quieter corner. I didn't give him the 43 pages. I gave him the summary, 7 months of documented pattern, the client concerns, the personnel impact, the paper trail I had. I told him about the Devereaux call. I told him about my colleague sitting alone in the conference room. I told him what had just happened to me near the bar. James Whitfield was not a man who reacted visibly to things. He listened with his arms slightly crossed and his eyes on me the whole time. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you have this documented?" "Yes. All of it. All of it." He nodded once. "I'm going to need you to stay available this weekend." He excused himself. I watched him find the other two representatives from the parent company. The three of them stepped out of the ballroom together. I went back to the event. I had a glass of water. I talked to clients. I smiled at the right moments. Nobody looking at me would have known anything had shifted. He gave his remarks around 8:30. I stood near the side of the room and listened to him talk about momentum and the future and leading with intention. He was very good at it. I'll give him that. The room responded well. A few people in my peripheral vision glanced at me, and I kept my expression neutral and attentive. He caught my eye once from the podium. I held his gaze for a moment and then looked away. Monday morning, I got to the office at 7:45. At 8:10, I was asked to come to a conference room on the executive floor, a room I'd been in exactly twice before. Both times were significant company decisions. The head of HR was there. So was the CEFO. So was the CEO, who had flown in from Chicago that morning. The VP was not there. The CEO, a woman who I had met maybe 4 times in 11 years but who had always made me feel like she actually remembered who I was, sat across from me and said, "Brooke, we've spent the weekend reviewing what was shared with us Friday evening and doing some preliminary verification. I want you to know that we take this seriously. We take the client concerns seriously. We take the personnel treatment seriously. And we take the documentation you provided seriously." I kept my hands folded on the table. She continued, "There will be an independent review. It will take approximately 3 weeks. During that time, we're asking you to remain in your role in full capacity. Your access has been fully restored as of this morning." I nodded. I said, "Thank you." Then she said, "I also want to say, and this is separate from the review, that it should not have gotten this far. That's a failure on our part, and I intend to address it." I did not cry in that room. I want to be clear about that. But I came close, not from relief exactly, more from the strange sensation of someone in authority saying the thing you'd started to wonder if anyone would ever say. The review took 4 weeks, not 3. I cooperated fully. I provided every document, every email, every contemporaneous note I had made. 3 of my colleagues gave statements. 2 clients submitted letters independently, including the Devereaux account. The VP resigned midway through the review. HR told me it was voluntary. I have my own opinions about how voluntary it was. The structural changes he had made to my portfolio were unwound. My original direct reports were returned to my team. The accounts that had been redistributed were reviewed one by one, and several came back. The Devereaux account came back. There were 2 people he had managed out of the company in the months before I started documenting. Their cases were reviewed separately. One was offered a settlement. The other was offered their position back. I don't know what they ultimately decided. That was private. But they were offered the choice, which is more than they'd had before. At the end of the process, the CEO called me directly. Not an email, a phone call. She said the review was closed and she asked me if I wanted to continue in my current role or whether I'd be open to a conversation about an expanded scope. I said I was open to a conversation. That conversation took place over 2 weeks and involved the CFO, the Chief of Staff, and eventually a formal offer. My title changed, my compensation changed, and the mentorship program that had quietly been defunded during the restructuring, a program I had helped design and that had moved 11 women into management roles in 7 years, was reinstated with a dedicated budget line. I still work in that building. I still walk past the 3rd-floor conference room. Sometimes when I do, I think about my colleague sitting at that table by herself. She's still with the company too. She was promoted last spring, back into client-facing work, which is exactly where she's always belonged. People ask me sometimes what I would have done differently. Whether there was a moment I wish I'd acted sooner, and I've thought about that a lot. The honest answer is that I don't know if sooner would have worked. The documentation took time to build. The pattern took time to become undeniable. The right person at the right event, James Whitfield in that corner of the ballroom, required all of those months of patience to mean anything. There's a version of this story where I stormed into HR in month 2 and got sent back to my desk. I've thought about that version. I didn't want to be that version. So I waited. I watched. I wrote everything down. I built something that couldn't be argued with. And when the moment arrived, I handed it over and let it speak for itself. That's not a story about revenge. That's a story about not letting the truth go quietly. The truth never needed my help being dramatic. It just needed somewhere to land. I've turned this over in my mind more times than I can count. Not the summit night itself. I've made a kind of peace with that, but the years before it, the slow erosion, the meetings I stopped being invited to, the morning I walked past that conference room and saw my colleague sitting alone at the table, holding herself very still, the way you do when you're trying not to come apart in a place where coming apart will be used against you. What I keep coming back to is this: the wrong that was done didn't happen all at once. It happened in increments. A reassigned account here, a removed CC there. A comment about someone being too emotionally reactive, dropped into a one-on-one and never documented. That's how these things work. They count on the small injuries being too small to report, too ambiguous to prove, too exhausting to fight. And for a long time that calculation is correct. What changed for me wasn't anger. Anger comes and goes. It's not a foundation you can build anything on. What changed was a decision. A quiet, private decision that I was going to treat the truth like it mattered even when nobody around me seemed to agree that it did. So I wrote things down. Dates, words, patterns. Not because I had a plan, but because I refused to let accurate things become uncertain just because someone with more organizational power preferred them to be. That's the part I want people to sit with, not the summit. Not the moment Whitfield stepped away from the ballroom with his colleagues, or the Monday morning when I walked into that executive floor conference room and the VP wasn't there. Those moments were the result of something. They didn't just happen to me. They happened because 11 years of doing the work honestly had made the truth easy to verify. Every client relationship I had built with real attention, every decision I had documented in real time, every colleague I had treated like a person worth respecting, all of it became evidence. Not the kind you manufacture, the kind that exists because you lived a certain way over a long period of time. There's a version of integrity that looks passive from the outside. It doesn't make speeches. It doesn't escalate at the first offense. It keeps showing up, keeps the record straight, keeps caring about the outcome even when caring is painful. That's actually the hardest kind. It requires you to hold your standards when the people above you have abandoned theirs, and to do it without becoming bitter, because bitterness poisons the record you're keeping, the intelligence part. And I mean this practically, not academically, is knowing the difference between the moment to act and the moment to wait. I could have gone to HR in month 2. I could have sent an angry email. I could have done a dozen things that would have felt satisfying for about 48 hours and then cost me everything I'd spent a decade building. Instead, I watched, and I thought, and I built something that couldn't be dismissed. That discipline, that patience with your own instincts is a skill. It doesn't come naturally. I had to choose it over and over again on days when choosing it felt like losing. What my colleague deserved, and what I deserved, and what every person in that company who had been quietly managed out or talked over or labeled too much deserved, was simple: to have the truth land somewhere solid. That's all I was trying to do. Give it somewhere to land. It did, and everything else followed from that.